I want to give you a broad picture of the political development of Egypt. In other words, just a broad overview of the development of political structures in Egypt. Not going into a lot of detail, but just giving you the broad overview. And but before I do, you might as well push pause on your on your video that you're watching, and go ahead and just jot down this timeline in your notebook so you have it all in one place. I know once you do, you're going to think I'm nuts for having you do such a thing, because it is kind of obvious. The pattern is kind of obvious, but it might help just to stop the video and then jot these down all in one place. Okay, welcome back. We're going to be starting with the Predysnastic period of Egyptian history. Now, this is a prehistoric period, so we don't know very much about it because the Egyptians at this time had not yet developed a written language. It's a Neolithic period, and I know you know what that means. It means that people are living in cities and that they have domesticated animals. Okay, they've not yet developed a written language. That's why they're prehistoric, but they do live in cities, and they do live in, or they do have domesticated animals. So we're going to start off with a look at Predysnastic or Neolithic Egypt. Although we don't know very much, I do want to include some of the things that we've been talking about so far. The first thing I guess to talk about is that you have the development of Neolithic societies in Egypt about circa 5000 BC, and pretty soon we start to see irrigation systems developing. You can have small communities living alongside the Nile River who live right next to the Nile River, and they can take buckets of water out of the Nile and pour it on their crops and that kind of thing. But as cities develop, as you have these much larger communities developing, then we have to have some kind of system to take water out to where people actually live. Why don't they just spread further out along the river? Well, for all kinds of reasons. Okay, a big one is security. Okay, if you spread yourself out along the river, then you're only one family away from the desert. You're one family away from the bad guys who might attack, or bad guys from 5 houses down might come get you, or whatever. So as you spread out, but try to stay together so that you have people to trade things with, and you can get access to other workmen and craftsmen and traders and things like that to conduct business. Well, then you start moving away from the river, but then you don't have water, right? Okay. So you go through a process, and this process that I'm laying out for you is pretty basic for most riverine civilizations. There may be some exceptions, but this is the basic pattern. First of all, you have to take the water out. The first place you irrigate is the marshlands. That's the swamplands that are next to the river. And so you build dams and mud dams to hold back the water, let the water dry, or you scoop it out with buckets, probably get the water moving more quickly. And then once you've dried out the swamps, you've dried out the marshlands, then you put the water back. What you do is now you've got dry land, right, where there used to be swampland. And so you dig the canals and ditches out to where people actually live, and then you put the water back. You knock down the dam, and you let the water that used to go out and spread out over the swampland now goes down into the canals and ditches and carries the water out to where people actually live. And now you've got water so you can plant. For almost everybody in this course you're going to be talking about, the major crop is wheat. Almost everybody. In fact, the exceptions are so few I may not even mention them as we go by, because wheat is the dominant cereal grain. Maybe you're into food and that kind of thing. The major cereal grain, wheat, for the ancient world. When I was a kid, a bread company, Roman Meal, used to run a TV advertising with a Roman soldier, and he had a staff in his hand, and he would say, "Wheat, the staff of life." Well, there's a lot of truth to that. For a lot of people, the support of their life, the staff of their life, was wheat. And then, of course, you harvest the wheat. And then after you harvest the wheat, at least in Egypt, you enjoy the floods. Why do I say enjoy the floods? Because the Egyptians celebrate every year when the floods come. The floods come annually. Water comes down from, there's a flood of water that comes down from Upper Egypt, which is southern Egypt, right? Remember? Comes down from Upper Egypt. It carries minerals and sediments and nutrition, fertilizer, all the stuff that's going to make next year's crop plenteous and nutritious, okay? And so you sit back and you enjoy and celebrate the floods. The Egyptians called these cities nomes. That's from a Greek word called nomos, which means law. In other words, kind of like a legal district. They call their cities legal districts, or the Greeks rather called the Egyptian cities legal districts. Neolithic cities, nomes. I'm kind of stumbling because we don't know what the Egyptians called them. We don't know what the Egyptians called their cities at this time in their history or in their story, because they weren't an historic people. They were a prehistoric people. They couldn't write down their story for us. But the Greeks, who, as I told you, were almost obsessed with the story of Egypt, as they poked through remembrances and from the historic period, called these early cities the nomes. And in each of these nomes, as our corollary to our second general principle of civilization tells us, somebody figured out how to control the water supply. In nome after nome after nome, somebody figured out how to control the water supply and then became the dictator of these little cities. The Greeks had a word for these people. They called them the nomarchs. That's nome for gnomes, and arch, that's the Greek word for to rule over. Now, over time, some of these nomes began to combine with each other. As the cities would grow, they kind of bump into each other. And so you would have these nomes becoming larger and larger and expanding larger and larger, and the nomarchs, of course, gaining more and more power. What happened when the two nomarchs of the two nomes that are growing and expanding and finally come to interlap with each other, we're not really sure what happened. My best guess is that they got in a fight or something. But one way or the other, this little tiny start of a political development begins in the Neolithic period. Well, as these gnomes become larger and larger, the irrigation, the control of the irrigation, which is driving this political development, leads to a point where we can have one nomarch or one king. The Greeks called him Menes. Even today, we're not quite sure what this man's name was, but the Greeks called him Menes. We know that there was one king over all of Egypt. He united Upper and Lower Egypt. That is because we had seen those nomes combined until we had a united nome, if that makes sense to you. One in Upper Egypt and one in Lower Egypt. But this man named Menes, in about 3100 BC, unifies Upper and Lower Egypt into one kingdom. Now we start the time period that we call the Old Kingdom. And it's kind of interesting. We don't know Menes' name. Or rather, we can't be sure. There are at least 3 different titles, and we're not quite sure which one was a name or which one was a title. But the Greek historian who first identified this individual, his name was Menes, and so he gave this king his own Greek name, Menes. It's just like today, kind of funny when like when a scientist discovers something, they get to give their own name to it, and so I guess that worked for Greek historians when they made a discovery. Then they got to name whoever they discovered after themselves. It's just kind of a funny kind of thing. But it's during Menes' reign that we see the development of the earliest type of Egyptian writing. And in this unit, you're going to be learning a little bit later about Egyptian writing. But this starts our historic period. And now we begin talking about the Old Kingdom. Although Menes is reigning about 3100 BC over a united Egypt, the height of the Old Kingdom comes about 400 years later, 400 years later, between roughly 2695 and 2160 BC. This is a time in which the Egyptians enjoyed great stability and security and prosperity and even vitality. And that's largely because, again, of its isolation. It feels very secure. It can prosper because it's not invaded by other empires. And it's a time of a lot of activity. And the growth of what Menes starts as a united monarch over Egypt develops into what the Egyptians called the pharaoh. You've probably run across that word before. It's spelled a little bit awkwardly in English. All right. The Egyptian word is per-a-a, which literally means big house. That tells you a little bit about the pharaoh. He lives in the big house. What is interesting about this is that the title pharaoh referring to a house, now we have a division between a political location and a person. Whoever lives in the big house is the pharaoh. And what's interesting about that is that there's an abstraction of political power, all right? And what I mean is we see this today, okay? If I say there's a message from the Oval Office, what that means is that the president has said something. That doesn't matter which president it is. If I say the Oval Office, you know I mean the office of the presidency. Or if I say Buckingham Palace has released an announcement, then you know that I'm referring to the royal family of England. This kind of abstraction of political power away from one person and locating it in a place, well, it's just kind of interesting what's going on here. But as a symbol of the growth of the power of the pharaoh, I mean, the idea that he's the guy who lives in the big house is kind of a big deal, all right? I'd like to take as a symbol of the height of the Old Kingdom the Great Pyramids at Giza. And I'm sure you studied this at some point. The greatest of the Great Pyramids, a pyramid built to honor the pharaoh Cheops, or sometimes that's spelled Cheops. Again, this is a name that the Greeks gave him, even though we know what this man's name was, but we still call him Cheops, the builder of the Great Pyramids. And I know you know an awful lot about you studied the pyramids before. The Great Pyramids at Giza, Giza, is also the location of the... Oh, sorry, I had another slide here. This is the Great Pyramids, right? There are 3 big ones and a few smaller ones there. The pyramids may be shaped kind of like ziggurats, but they serve a very different purpose. You remember the ziggurats that the Sumerians began building, and then the Akkadians built more, and the Babylonians built more. That's that thin, narrow cultural thread of continuity. But you remember that the ziggurats were artificial mountains for the gods to live on top of. The pyramids serve as permanent memorials and also as tombs, of course. I know you know this, of the pharaohs. But Giza, Giza, is also the location of the Sphinx, a pharaoh Khafre. We saw Khafre's sculpture a little bit earlier in the course. And there you see in the background are the 2 of the Great Pyramids of Giza. And I'd like for you to remember, certainly the Great Pyramids of Giza and even the Sphinx, as symbols of the power of the pharaohs. I mean, the pyramids, and there's all kinds of stuff we could talk about this, the technology that's involved in simply building them, let alone the fact that they line up to true north, with as much precision as we can get with GPS systems today. They are monuments, great historical projects, but also not just that, but I'm trying to go backwards here, but they symbolize the pharaoh's power. This took many men and women spent their lives building these pyramids just to honor the pharaohs. Again, the pharaohs, like Cheops, there we go. Again, the pharaohs are the big shots. They live in the big house, okay? They had the job of keeping the gods happy, and that's a pretty difficult job, because as you're going to see, the gods in Egypt are pretty mean too. The pharaohs have another job that the Sumerian kings didn't have, and that was their job was to make the sun come up in the morning and go down at night. That one was pretty easy, okay? But a huge amount of power. I mean, how much power do you think you would have to order teams of people to build this kind of thing, just so you'd have a place for your body to rest? What kind of arrogance to have teams of men spending their lives making a statue of you? Well, this is an awful lot of power. But things fall apart. Things fall apart, and we enter what we call the First Intermediate Period, where we don't know very much at all. very few historical records